Tonight's story is Who Hid the Letter in the Garden Gate? Welcome, dear listener, to Street Merry Mead, where quiet hedges and well-tended lawns sometimes hide the most curious of puzzles. I'm your host, Charles Whitmore. One soft autumn morning, a folded envelope was discovered, tucked between the iron bars of the Vicarage gate. No name, no address, only a pair of initials traced in an oddly disguised hand. It seemed a trifle, yet in this village, trifles often whisper of larger secrets. If you enjoy gentle mysteries in the spirit of Miss Marple, do subscribe and keep company with us for the tales yet to come. Now, let us step through the Vicarage garden path and see where this quiet oddity may lead. Chapter 1. A Curious Discovery. The morning had that slow, attentive quality which Street Merry Mead wore like an old shawl cool air scented with cut grass. The hedges still beaded with a faint lingering of dew, and the village lanes already beginning to stir with the small errands that made up a parish day. Miss Jane Marple was potting her roses by the cottage window, her fingers knowing, as always, the precise twist the plants required. She paused, trowel in hand, because through the glass she saw Mrs. Price Ridley hastening along the path toward the vicarage, cheeks flushed with the urgency of one who believes the world has forgotten the right order of things. Mrs. Price Ridley had the habit of treating every minor irregularity as a summons. It was part of her usefulness and her entertainment. On this day she was indeed agitated. Miss Marple wiped her hands on her apron, set aside the little pot she was about to transplant, and, with the unhurried curiosity of someone for whom nothing stayed secret for long, went out to meet whatever small commotion had presented itself. The vicarage gate stood ajar, its black ironwork glinting against the soft green of the clipped yew hedge. Leonard and Griselda Clement's garden beyond was a careful, kindly place. A strip of lawn, beds of late roses, a scattering of herbaceous plants, and a little gravel walk that led to the front door. Griselda herself was at the threshold, with the faint look of a woman who has been called to account by circumstance rather than by scandal. She welcomed Miss Marple with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "It is nothing, Jane, really," Griselda began, but the sentence toppled when Mrs. Price Ridley, breathless and officious, produced the cause of alarm. Tucked, as neatly as though by an obliging hand, between one of the bars of the wrought-iron gate and the ivy that clung to it, was an envelope. Only half of it peeped out, the rest was hidden by the curling leaves and the shadow they threw. It was an odd place for a letter to rest, and it made a small hard knot of astonishment in Miss Marple's chest, not for the drama of the object itself, but because trifles in Street Merry Mead always bore the weight of meaning. Griselda reached with a calmness that had been practised by women who deal with restless parishioners, and drew the envelope free. It was sealed. There was no postmark, no stamp, no address. On the front, in a careful hand, were two initials, H.R. The script had an air of deliberate simplicity, as if somebody had tried to be plain and by doing so had revealed something else. Perhaps it was left for Leonard, Griselda suggested, in the manner of those who wish to restore ordinary usefulness to an odd object. People often slip notes when they do not wish to speak. Mrs. Price Ridley was in a hurry to supply conjectures. "Could be a love letter," she said, with a rapid optimism. "Could be money, though that's unlikely. Could be, who knows what people do nowadays." She glanced about as though expecting a dramatic confession to step out from behind the roses. The Blue Boar Inn was likely to be a suitable theatre for such a scene, if anyone had been inclined to suggest one. Miss Marple, accustomed to living by the measure of other people's ordinary days, looked at the envelope as one inspects the growth on a plant, not for the novelty, but for the pattern. She turned it between her fingers, feeling the slight oil of long usage on the paper where hands had repeatedly touched the seal. There was a tiny crease, a faint smudge, and a margin where the hand that had addressed it had hesitated as if weighing the form of a letter. The initials H.R. were written with a hand that had a slight leftward slant, and the capital H bore a peculiar loop as if the writer had tried to make it smaller, less characteristic. "It is very discreet," Miss Marple observed. "Somebody took pains. That's just it." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Why take such pains? If it were anything important, one would think it would be posted." Griselda's face, usually the most placid in the parish, reflected a small unease. "It was here this morning when I went out to fetch the morning's papers," she said. "I noticed a little sound at the gate, barely anything, and upon looking, I thought I had found a leaf caught in the ironwork. Then I saw the paper. It was shut up so neatly." Miss Marple's mind threaded small facts together the way she threaded a needle. The morning's papers, the half-hidden envelope, the careful sealing, and the absence of stamp or postmark, these were not the elements of carelessness. They suggested intention. A desire that the letter should be found by the household rather than sent through the official channels. That intention made the letter, in Miss Marple's quiet way, an act of its own. The vicar, with his gentle, practical manner, came out to see what his wife and neighbours had gathered about. Dr. Haydock, who chanced by on his early round, peered with only professional curiosity. He was used to griefs and ailments which showed themselves in less coy guises than folded paper. Colonel Bantry, returning from an aimless walk about his own estate, paused on the path, more interested in the prospect of tea and the Bantrys' worldly concerns than in the particularities of the village's mysteries. Dolly Bantry, when informed, would have sent an urgent basket of cake and sympathy in equal measure. She had the talent of making every disturbance into an occasion for hospitality. Miss Marple held the envelope up to the light so that the others could see there was no writing through the paper, no sign of tearing or of anything tucked within that might be felt by touch. The seal plain, the colour of the paper was damp enough that one might have thought it still a little pliant, as if recent. The script, she noted, had been deliberately simplified. The person who wished to disguise their hand sometimes adopted a humble, almost clumsy manner of writing. The effect of disguise is to call attention to itself. "Do you think some young gentleman has been foolish?" Mrs. Price Ridley suggested, as if scandal must always travel by romance. "Sometimes foolishness takes subtler forms," Miss Marple said, thinking of how often little deceptions were used to conceal even more commonplace embarrassments. An unpaid debt, an old friendship misinterpreted, a pension delayed. She said no more. It was not her way to leap to conclusions. Her attention, instead, lingered on the small particularities, the paper's exact grain, the faint pressure of the pen at certain turns of the letters, the way the writer had tried, and not wholly succeeded, to look casual. There was another detail, easily missed. A tiny streak along one edge, not a smudge of ink, but the faint grey aftermark of something that might have brushed the envelope as it was slipped into place. Miss Marple rubbed it with her thumb and found it left no residue. Perhaps it was only a trace of coal dust from the lane, or the dull smear of garden loam. Yet such trivial traces were the very things that told stories in Street Mary Mead. She made a note of it in her mind, without telling the others. There are observations one keeps, until they fit into a larger pattern. The neighbours discussed what might be done. Inspector Slack, whom Miss Marple respected for his sturdy common sense, was generally inclined to treat such matters with a polite scepticism. The idea of summoning more official attention for a stray envelope seemed, to some, disproportionate, but to Miss Marple an object like this had the authority to demand thought. It was not yet a problem to be solved, more an occasion for watching. "Leave it to the vicarage for the moment," she said. "If anything further comes of it, we shall see. People are curious creatures, and they like finding the answers to their own puzzles." Griselda folded the envelope into the neatest, most domestic of precautions. She placed it upon a small side table near the front door, between a bowl of keys and a vase of late roses which Clement had clipped that very morning. The domesticness of the gesture, putting the oddity among the useful things, calmed some of the excitable speculation. It made the strange neat and ordinary. Still, as Miss Marple turned back toward her own cottage, she carried with her the small persistent curiosity that a good gardener brings to an unfamiliar shoot. The handwriting had looked as if it intended to be unremarkable and had, in doing so, betrayed a careful intention. That tiny contradiction lodged in her thoughts like a seed. She had the vague sense that this little folded paper would not remain simply a trifle for long. It was, she reflected, the kind of beginning that asked to be watched rather than explained at once, and Miss Marple, who had the leisure and patience for such watching, meant to watch. This discovery would prompt more questions than answers before the week was out. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. The high street of Street Mary Mead had the reassuring rhythm of small shops opening their doors, of shutters thrown back, and the smell of fresh bread mingling with the damp of the lane. It was an avenue of ordinary transactions, a coin here, a loaf there, and in those transactions the village kept itself upon a level and comfortable plane. On that particular morning the ordinary plane was, in its own mild fashion, a little rippled. News travelled fastest where people gathered. The grocer's steps, the little post office window, Mrs. Price Ridley's habitual place under the awning of Hartnell's haberdashery. Miss Hartnell was arranging a new display of ribbons, taking an artist's pleasure in the small gradations of colour. She had on her gloves the neat, practical gloves suitable for a busy shopkeeper, and the expression of someone who enjoyed affairs that admitted a touch of drama. Beside her, Mrs. Price Ridley stood with the upright obstinacy of a woman who believed in the spiritual value of punctuality. "It was here this very morning," she declared, in that brisk voice which served her so well when turning the village tide of opinion. Tucked at the vicarage gate, like a secret waiting to be admired, the two women spoke in that quick, efficient way which is half speculation and half entertainment. They spoke of the envelope Miss Marple had seen, and Griselda Clement had brought in. They spoke of its initials, and the oddness of an unposted letter, left where it might be found by any passer-by. Hartnell, with a shopkeeper's instinct for the theatrical, suggested immediately that it might be a love letter of the sort that had enlivened romances in the village for years. Mrs. Price Ridley allowed a momentary flourish of scandal to colour her small smile. "It could be quite innocent," Miss Hartnell objected, more from the desire to deflect alarm than from any particular faith in innocence. "But curious all the same. Who leaves things like that now unless they wish someone to find them?" They were not alone in their curiosity. A pair of men paused at the butcher's window to read what they could gather from the drift of voices. The postmaster, who had appeared as if in answer to an internal clock, leaned against his counter, listening with a patient smile. In Street Mary Mead. Gossip was not merely idle. It was a careful, almost civic, exchange that preserved the social fabric while adding a certain crispness to everyday life. It was at this moment that Dolly Bantry arrived, looking as if she had been called by instinct rather than by appointment. She swept down the pavement in a light coat, an urgent basket upon her arm, and an expression which balanced the business of hospitality with the thrill of a social adventure. "Dolly!" cried Mrs. Price Ridley, who was never too proud to enact the welcome of a smaller queen. Dolly, brisk and animated, took in the tableau in a breath, and without ceremony announced that Miss Marple must be told at once. "Jane will want to know. She'll make sense of it in tea and time." Dolly's arrival, and her immediate conclusion, set the tone. Any small mystery became, for Dolly, an occasion for tea, and the bringing together of people who might, by chance and conversation, shed light on a matter. Colonel Bantry, who had been ambling beside his wife, and who carried his pipe as if it were a badge of contemplative authority, made an absent-minded remark about the usefulness of neat fences and the ways of neighbours. "All these new-fangled secrets," he said, puffing a thin column of smoke. "One can manage with honesty. Nothing keeps a village tidy like a good airing." "Perhaps," Dolly answered with a smile and a rapid glance at the ribbon display in Hartnell's window. "But a little curiosity need not be unkind. Jane will look after the niceties." Conversation in the High Street broadened. The Blue Boar Inn was sited with that necessary village impartiality, and the inn's snug bar often became a place where strangers' reasons were smoothed into gossip. "The Blue Boar," Mrs. Price Ridley said, lowering her voice as if for effect, "is a very convenient place for a visitor who wishes to be unremarked. Strangers can tie themselves up in a corner and seem local in no time." From the butcher's window came the remark that a newcomer had indeed taken rooms in the Blue Boar of late. The postmaster, who prided himself on recording comings and goings, confirmed that a gentleman had registered the night before, giving only a transient address. "He paid his bill in cash," said the postmaster, "and asked no questions. Simple sort. Keeps himself to himself." The detail arrived like a bright seed dropped into the village's ready soil. A newcomer at the Blue Boar. The phrase passed from mouth to mouth and collected a dozen possibilities. Love, financial impropriety, mistaken identity, Blackmail, these were the narrative shapes gossip found easiest to wear. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose imagination was well stocked with such stories, allowed each to bloom for a moment and then pruned them back as any prudent neighbour must. "Money is as likely as romance," suggested Miss Hartnell, handing over a parcel of buttons with the air of someone who regards human behaviour as a haberdashery of motives. "Or perhaps he has business. Men who pass through often carry their own troubles." Dolly, always quick to rescue a speculation from gloom, framed the matter in a brighter light. "Perhaps he's an author," she said, smiling at the idea of an intellectual fall into the village. "Or a retired officer writing his memoirs. Either way, we shall bring him tea if he comes into our circle." The thread of conjecture wound through the high street, gathering small corroborations. Mrs. Price Ridley remembered how she had seen, from across the lane, a man in a dark coat standing near the inn's window and apparently watching the lane. The baker's lad insisted he had seen the same figure late in the evening, the outline of a broad-shouldered visitor who seemed to walk slowly, as if contemplating something private. Nothing here was definitive. Village testimony was a lantern that illuminated different angles of the same object. Miss Marple listened with that attentive face which had often turned village gossip into useful knowledge. She drew comfort from the domestic details that accompanied the talk. Dolly's rapid planning of teas, Hartnell's precise folding of ribbons, the postmaster's ledger marked carefully with arrivals. For it is in such small facts that clarity often hides, she noted, with a soft and private pleasure, the way the high street made even the most tentative piece of news into a communal possession. People shared these things. They offered them the gentle attention of neighbours. Her own thoughts moved in a leisurely orbit. The presence of a newcomer did not necessarily mean anything sinister. Men arrived and left for reasons large and small. A temporary posting, a wish for quiet, or the simple desire to be beyond a crowded life. Yet the manner of the letter at the vicarage kindly suggested intention. An unposted note left at a gate with no stamp, no postmark, was an act chosen to be seen by those who passed the gate. The Blue Boar's new lodger, if indeed he had been observed near the vicarage, might be connected to that intention. Then again he might not. Miss Marple would not, at this stage, draw a line between the two. She preferred the patient business of noticing, and of letting the village's own rhythm reveal the links it contained. As the morning moved on, the high street filled with the pleasant apparatus of daily life. A child's satchel thumped against a mother's skirts. The grocer folded his parcel with a man's careful hand. A bicyclist stopped to exchange a word. Yet under these ordinary noises, the new detail, a stranger at the Blue Boar, hummed like a faint undertone, altering the colour of casual remarks. Before Dolly departed to marshal her forces of hospitality and tea, Mrs. Price Ridley made one remark in a tone thin with excitement. "I heard and do listen. People mustn't be too quick to speak, but I heard that the gentleman at the Blue Boar was seen by the vicarage gate late last night. Quiet, they said, going away as if he meant no harm. Odd, isn't it? When a thing happens and then sits so nicely where anyone might find it." The remark showed the village at its most human. The smallest observation could set wider thoughts working. To some it was merely an overlapping of events, to others it was the faint start of a pattern. Miss Hartnell, who had her business to tend, folded the new sliver of information into her careful mind. Dolly, whose mission was to make hospitality a remedy, decided mentally to bring an extra plate of cakes to the Blue Boar the next time she passed. Miss Marple, with the quiet patience that comes from knowing how often small things explain great ones, simply made a note, inward and unspoken, to see how that one observation might be joined to the rest. It was the kind of whisper that would draw other whispers toward it, and whispers in Street Mary Mead rarely remained idle. Chapter Tress, Dolly's Curiosity. The afternoon sun lay soft upon Gossington Hall, as though it too favoured small confidences. Dolly Bantry's drawing-room was a cheerful room of cushions and samplers, of a piano that had been tuned only yesterday, and of teacups that always seemed to fit a hand as if by perfect design. Miss Marple, having accepted Dolly's urgent summons with the gentle alacrity of an old friend, found the hostess already in motion. An extra plate of seed cake, a pot of tea that steamed fragrantly, and the swift, efficient bustle which Dolly turned to so many things that needed both sympathy and order. They sat near the window, where the light picked out the neat scatter of roses on the terrace and gilded Colonel Bantry's grey moustache as he reclined in a chair with his well-worn pipe between his fingers. He grumbled in that genial fashion which had long ago become one of his charms, as if the world were by rights somewhat less complicated than people made it. But his eyes, as they always did, missed nothing for long. Dolly began with the conversational flourish she favoured, a sketch of events made vivid by the particulars of domestic care. "I found Jane with the envelope," Dolly said, setting a slice of cake upon Miss Marple's saucer with the proud, precise hand of a woman who believed cake had a diplomatic function. "Delighted to see you, of course. But she must hear. It's at the Vicarage gate, and Griselda exhibited it as though it were something she had knitted herself." Dolly spoke with the mixture of amusement and seriousness that made her so persuasive. "Jane, I do hope you'll lend us your thoughts. You see, we all think we know how village business goes, but this is odd." Miss Marple folded her hands around the teacup with the small movements of someone who takes pleasure in ritual. "Little things," she said, in that soft, knowing voice of hers, "betray larger secrets. We must not scorn what appears trivial." The remark was not a pronouncement so much as a readiness to consider. It was the sort of sentence which, in Street, Mary Mead prompted others to supply their own observations. Colonel Bantry barked a low, affectionate laugh. "You always make a mystery out of a molehill, Jane," he observed, blowing a thin ring of smoke. "If someone leaves an envelope at a gate, it's often because they're clumsy, or romantic, or forgetful. Best not to begin theories until all the facts are as tidy as Dolly's little cakes." Dolly smiled at the jab, not put out in the least, and then sank into her more serious mode. "Griselda thinks it was left for Leonard," she said. "That seems sensible. But why leave a note like that instead of posting it? And why with only initials?" She tapped the saucer, as if counting points upon her fingers. Miss Marple nodded slowly, remembering the paper she had held earlier, the neat seal, the faint hesitation in the hand. "People who wish their matters private sometimes choose odd places to entrust them," she remarked. "A gate between neighbours is less public than the post. It is meant to be found by those who pass that way, not by the whole world." "You mean someone wanted the Clements to see it," Dolly said, "but not have it go further?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple answered. She allowed her mind to move among the domestic facts. The time of day the envelope was noticed, the manner in which Griselda had placed it on the hall table with the keys and the roses, the lack of postmark. Each detail softened or sharpened a potential shape of meaning. Or perhaps the writer wished to give the impression of some outside force. Whoever finds such things takes the story in hand, and stories travel. Their talk was punctuated by small village particulars, Colonel Bantry's amiable grumbling about fences, Dolly's brief report on the inefficiencies of a new maid who could not fold a napkin to her satisfaction, and the way the afternoon's light made the gilding on the piano look like a brass coin. These domesticities kept the conversation anchored. As gossip in Street, Mary Mead preferred to be anchored in the manageable world of cups and cakes and the occasional misplaced lorgnette. It was Dr. Haydock's name that then drifted into their circle, as neat and inevitable as a seam that must be stitched. "Dr. Haydock mentioned to me the other day," Dolly said, "that he had a new patient in the village. Came late last night, he did. With simple things a burn on his hand, he said, though one can never quite trust an excuse for the state of a gentleman's hands. Doctor. Haydock is discreet, of course, but he's been rather curious these past hours." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, not with excitement but with affectionate interest. The mention of a new patient set a little mechanism of thought turning in her mind. The doctor's discreet observation was a commonplace that might yet show a useful seam. "Dr. Haydock sees what people will not tell," she said. "A physician's knowledge is often of practical matters that gossip cannot supply." Colonel Bantry, having finished his pipe and puffed out a soft cloud, grunted his approval of such pragmatism. "Good man, that Haydock. Keeps his nose where it won't ruffle up other folks' feathers unnecessarily." He shifted in his chair, and, for all his grumbling, listened with the keen interest of one who liked to know the nature of a thing before passing judgment. Dolly, fanning herself with an invitation card she had picked up in the last pocket of her coat, returned to the particulars. "If there is a newcomer at the Blue Boar," she said, "we should be ready to offer him civility. If he is the sort to be shy or in trouble, a kind cup of tea often helps. If he is one of those who prefers solitude, that too we must respect. But we shall know more if we are courteous. Her practical charity was of that sort which made it difficult for other people to be unkind. Miss Marple thought of the vicarage gate in the soft light of that afternoon. The image of a letter tucked away, the initials on its face, and a newcomer in the blue boar began to form a little constellation in her mind, though she would not yet name any of the stars. She was content to watch how the village arranged itself around these points, to see which neighbours' paths crossed and which stories grew in the careful soil of routine. Before she left, Dolly took Miss Marple's hand with the small ceremony that tended always to accompany the exchange of confidences in her house. "Do come to tea tomorrow," Dolly said. "We shall have more questions than answers, but that's the pleasure of piecing together a thing with friends." Miss Marple smiled, promising, and stepped back into the pale day. As she crossed the gravel drive, she paused to glance at the low wall that edged Gossington's garden, thinking of Colonel Bantry's remark about fences and Dr. Haydock's discreet curiosity. A small movement in Dove Lane caught her eye, the brief silhouette of a man passing away from the high street. And though it was nothing more than the casual rhythm of a village afternoon, Miss Marple's attention, happy for small business to occupy it, noted the outline with the care of one keeping a private ledger of ordinary observations. That evening, as the village settled and lamps were put out in parlours and the Blue Boar's windows glowed warmly into the dusk, Miss Marple would find that one or two of these little facts had taken on a new significance. For the present, however, they were merely the comfortable scaffolding of curiosity. Chapter 4. A stranger at the inn. The Blue Boar had that snug, hospitable smell which belonged to inns that had been at the heart of a village for generations. Roast meat, mingled with the faint tang of ale, polished wood warm under the hand, and the steady, reassuring creak of a settle by the fire. It was one of those places where travellers could fold themselves into a corner and appear, without giving offence, to be as local as anyone. Dolly Bantry, who held the gentle conviction that a cup of tea could civilize most mysteries, declared with her usual briskness that the newcomer must be observed, and so she and Miss Marple took their seats at a small table near the window. Dolly's insistence had the particular energy of a hostess, who believed action to be a form of kindness. "We shall not confront him," she said, smoothing the napkin beneath her teacup with the sure fingers of a woman used to arranging things into pleasant order. "We shall simply be civil and watch. There is no harm in knowing one's neighbours better." Colonel Bantry, having been persuaded to come along by the promise of a return to his favourite armchair and the possibility of engaging conversation, flicked his pipe between his fingers and made one of those half-complaints he took for conversation. "Very well," he grumbled, "but only because Dolly insists. I shall not make a mystery of a gentleman who chooses to be quiet." Miss Marple, who had the small lamp of curiosity always nearby, felt perfectly content with this plan. The Blue Boar's window gave a good view of the lane, and, with modest politeness, allowed people to be watched without the unpleasantness of spying. It was an appropriate place, too, to see what manner of a man a newcomer might be. The way he took his cup, the neatness of his gloves, the tone of his voice when he addressed the landlady. All these signs, Miss Marple knew, were as instructive as many speeches. The newcomer was introduced to them with that soft village informality which changed strangers into guests before any formalities were required. He came down the stairs and paused near their table. He was of middle height, with a habitually erect carriage, the sort that suggests a life of some order. His hair, though touched with grey, retained a disciplined sweep at the temple. His manner was affable. He smiled with just enough reserve to be pleasant, and with just enough reserve to be defensible as a man who liked his privacy. "Mr. Rowland," the landlady said, with the small pride of an innkeeper who could present a stranger as if he were a new cut of meat on the platter. "He's from town," keeping to himself for the moment. There was no name beyond that, though Dolly, in the rustle of her interest, pressed a little for more. "Civil servant in retirement," the landlady supplied at last, with a nod that meant little beyond the acknowledgment of a livelihood. "Quiet gentleman." Ordered tea and a plate of ham. Mr. Henry Rowland took the chair with that economy of motion which comes from habit. He accepted Dolly's offer of cake with a polite smile and a small, slightly apologetic inclination of his head. He was easy with his manners, but refused to give more than the smallest facts about his reasons for being in Street Mary Mead. "I wanted some quiet for a little while," he said, in that unobtrusive voice which asks only to be permitted its own peace. "A certain change of scene, nothing more." He spoke, in short, with a civility that made direct questions appear intrusions. Griselda Clement, who had come into the Blue Boar to fetch a small order for the vicarage, stood near the door and greeted them with that modest smile which made people disclose things without realizing it. She was, by nature, a careful woman, but that care sometimes yielded slips. In the pleasant warmth of the inn, she found herself speaking more freely than she had meant. "Oh, Mr. Rowland," she said, with the small beginning of a remark that was more like a footnote to a conversation. "I thought I saw someone walk past the vicarage gate last night. A gentleman in a dark coat, quite late." The sentence fell into the group like the sudden note of a handbell. Mr. Rowland, obedient to the manners which had seen him through many formalities, continued his conversation as if the remark had been an amiable observation, and not a pin dropped in the water. For a moment the talk gathered around harmless things: weather, the state of the roads, the step of a new maid in a neighbouring household. Inspector Slack, who had been in the inn on official business of the most ordinary kind of matter concerning a missing parcel, and an irate customer sat at a corner table and heard the drift of words. He raised his eyes, took in the minor excitement, and smiled with the mild scepticism which official life tends to cultivate. Slack's dismissal was matter of fact, and, to him, kindly. "Old hens gossiping," he said, loud enough for the nearest listeners to hear, and with that tone which was meant to soothe both the curious and the anxious. He pushed his cap back and resumed his paper. "Keep an eye, ladies, if you must, but there's no need to make a business of it. A gentleman taking tea is not automatically trouble." Miss Marple respected Inspector Slack's steadiness. He had a practical mind and an affection for common sense, yet she noticed that his calmness sometimes allowed the village's quieter truths to slide by unnoticed. There was an economy in his judgments that suited the town's order, but not always the finer grain of personal quirks which Miss Marple liked to notice. She watched him with that small, admiring patience one reserves for people who have particular talents and habits. Over the next hour the conversation around the table unfolded in the polite cadence of village life. Mr. Rowland was affable, but kept his reasons for staying discreet. He spoke of walks in the lanes, of the pleasantness of routine, and of his enjoyment of a quiet book in the evenings. He asked a courteous question about parish times and about the Blue Boar's landlord, and then, as if to change subject, inquired whether Colonel Bantry liked his tobacco strong. It was while Mr. Rowland lifted his cup to his lips that Miss Marple noticed a small detail which one might have overlooked in a noisier company. As his hand rose, a signet ring flashed upon his little finger, a modest band of gold, its face dull from use and engraved with 2 initials. Miss Marple's eye, practised in the observation of hands, caught the shape at once. It was a neat monogram. H.R. The letters were arranged simply, the H leaning into the curve of the R, as if in a private embrace. A small, inhospitable silence followed Miss Marple's inward recognition. She did not speak immediately. It was not her habit to startle or to cast accusations across a tea-table, but Dolly, quick to note the smallest human signal, leaned forward and addressed Mr. Rowland with even more warmth. "What a pretty ring," she said, tilting her head. "A family piece, perhaps?" Mr. Rowland touched the ring with a faint expression of surprise, as if the existence of such a thing in his life had not been meant for comment. "It belonged to my father," he answered, with the modest reserve of a man who is accustomed to personal items being treated as part of the ordinary furniture of oneself. He was Henry Rowland, Senior. We were a practical sort. The remark, small and unembellished, completed the small loop between the envelope's initials and the signet's engraving. Miss Marple felt, with that particular pleasure which comes from joining 2 small facts, the faint beginning of a pattern, the initials on the envelope, the initials on the ring, yet she said nothing aloud. To notice, in Street Mary Mead, is often more useful than to proclaim. The mind gathers what it can, and time reveals whether those gatherings amount to a design. Inspector Slack, watching the exchange in the corner of his eye, shrugged and returned to his newspaper. To him the coincidence was a mere triviality. To the women clustered over the teacups, it was a detail that would feed further curiosity. Dolly, already thinking of a plan to offer a careful civility to Mr. Rowland, made a mental note to invite him for tea at Gossington, Colonel Bantry, pipe relit, grunted contentedly and made an absent remark about the certainty with which people like to carry their initials into the world. Mr. Rowland rose at length, thanking the company for their civility and making a short, composed bow. He moved away down the lane with the calm step of a man who keeps to himself by choice and not by fear. Miss Marple watched him go, the signet ring still turning in her memory like a tiny coin. It was a small revelation, the sort that does not accuse, but quietly alters the significance of what had been noticed. The initials on a ring, the initials on an envelope. In street, Mary Mead, such echoes were rarely entirely meaningless. Miss Marple, with the soft determination that had guided her in many a small puzzle, tucked the detail away to be seen against what else the village would provide in its own unhurried manner. Later that evening, when the lamps were lit and the village settled to the domestic rhythm of supper and mending, that small match of initials would begin to draw other faint threads closer. For the present it remained, as Miss Marple liked to keep such things, a neat piece of knowledge laid between the pages of daily life. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Unease. The afternoon had drawn its curtains early that week. A low, grey light lay over the vicarage garden, as if the clouds themselves were inclined to be discreet. Leonard Clement moved about his study with the deliberate motions of a man whose life was governed by parish hours and the steady demands of a congregation. Griselda, who took particular pleasure in arranging cuttings and the last roses of the season in their small glass vases, kept glancing toward the door as though expecting some errand to require her kindly attention. The vicarage was, as ever, a place of domestic ordinariness, hymn books on the shelf, a brass coal scuttle by the hearth, a neat line of keys on a hook, and it was in such ordinary places that peculiar things felt all the less at home. It was Leonard himself who paused, in the middle of writing a note concerning next Sunday's service, and frowned at the sight of paper upon his mat. Something had been slipped under the front door with the unobtrusive certainty of a hand that wished not to be seen. Griselda, at the kettle, called out, and then came to his side, wiping her hands on her apron as if this small interruption required the ceremony of tidiness. The envelope glanced up at them, white against the scuffed mat, and bore no stamp, no return, no flourish, as if someone had thought to deliver a private thing by private means. Leonard took it in his hand with the quiet reserve of one who handles parish matters with discretion. He turned it over. It was sealed, but when he opened it there was nothing inside. No letter, no scrap, no message. The paper yielded a small particular disappointment when unfolded, and then lay smooth and dull. An empty envelope, Leonard observed, with the mild bewilderment of a man unused to mysteries beyond the occasional errant sheep. Perhaps a mistake. Griselda's face betrayed a small alarm. "It was not here when I looked this morning," she said, "and yet perhaps someone placed it, and then took the letter away. It felt, when I picked it up, as if it had been placed with care." Miss Marple, who had been summoned by Dolly in a note full of the warm urgency that Dolly's messages always carried, sat near the window in the parlour and listened with that still attention which often makes room for what others miss. She had, only 2 mornings before, turned the other envelope between her fingers and noted its neat seal and the initials upon it. The presence, now, of this second envelope silently deposited and empty, altered the mood from accidental to deliberate, and from curious to requiring a little more care. "There is a difference," Miss Marple said softly, as if speaking to Griselda alone, though Leonard and Dolly were equally near. "A single stray thing may be a trifle. A second one that arrives in such a manner asks to be noticed. People rarely act without reason." Her voice had the unpressed patience of someone who had seen many small acts stack into a shape of consequence. Griselda told them then what had been at the back of her mind, the small thing she had thought to ignore. "Last night," she admitted, "I rose to look at the nursery fire, and when I came to the window I thought I saw someone walking past the gate. I did not go out. It was late, and the lane was dark. But there was the figure of a man in a dark coat, and he paused as if he had looked in at the vicarage. It may have been nothing at all, perhaps only a passer-by, but it came to me again when I found this." Her fingers smoothed the envelope as if it were a curious coin. Dolly, who prided herself on a ready competence, tapped the pattern of her teacup with an energetic finger. "We must be practical," she said. If someone is taking pains to leave things here, then perhaps we should be as attentive as they are. Colonel Bantry, lounging with his pipe at his elbow, made an encouraging but not over-earnest sound. "Keep a weather eye," he said, more in the mood for a return to his armchair than for midnight vigils, but the remark at least acknowledged the matter's significance. Miss Marple scented. In the little domestic choreography of the day, the habits of a hand that preferred the quiet to the public, she rose and followed Griselda to the gate, and together they went out beneath the low sky. The ironwork clicked softly when Griselda pushed it open, and the hedges murmured in the faint autumn breeze. At the gate itself, Miss Marple moved more slowly, examining with habitual affection the small details a gardener delights in the clasping of ivy, the neatness of trimming, yet also with the keen eye of someone who had learned to read the world like a book. It was there that Miss Marple noticed the faintest of things, a lingering scent that belonged not to roses nor to wet earth, but to tobacco. Not the harsh sting of a recent pipe, nor the strong aroma that clung to a gentleman's coat, but a grey domestic smell, like the memory of Colonel Bantry's pipe when it has been left to smoulder in a favourite corner. She breathed it in with that gentle deliberation which is characteristic of the small village routine. "Pipe tobacco," she murmured. "Not unpleasant. A man who smokes, and who perhaps has the gentleness of sitting alone by his thoughts." Griselda, who prided herself for the neatness with which she kept house and garden, wrinkled her nose at the suggestion. "But we had not had any visitor who smokes, Jane. At least not near the gate. It is odd to find such a thing about the hinges." The detail seemed trivial to anyone who preferred grander matters, yet Miss Marple knew how often an odour could anchor an image, how the smell of tobacco might recall a hand, a particular habit, a corner in which one sits. It fitted, rather neatly, with the morning's story of an envelope tucked into the ironwork, and with the memory from the high street that a newcomer had taken rooms at the Blue Boar. It was, she thought, a small thread that might connect 2 or 3 modest facts together. Dr. Haydock arrived by chance just as they were closing the gate behind them. He had been called to attend a household with a sprained ankle, and paused, in the way doctors do, with the quiet aspects of life upon his mind. He was discreet by nature, and spoke in kindly, economical sentences. "An empty envelope," he said, removing his hat and peering at the kitchen table where Griselda had placed the paper. "That is curious. I had a gentleman in my rooms last night who appeared distracted. He had a small burn upon his hand and a certain restlessness. Nothing to alarm one, perhaps, but he took his leave without much talk." Miss Marple nodded. The doctor's casual remark fitted with the web. She was assembling an unfastened thread, perhaps, that led to a man who was not entirely settled. Yet she did not allow herself to leap. "People have reasons," she said again, "and sometimes they give us small signs rather than long explanations." Inspector Slack, whom Dolly had not summoned but who seemed to have a remarkable talent for arriving when civic curiosity needed moderation, called upon them a few hours later with an expression at once comforting and brisk. He had the official kindness of a man who has to decide what deserves his energy. "Empty envelope, you say?" he asked, folding his hands on his cap. "Most likely a misdelivered thing. You needn't fuss yourselves into a mystery. The world is full of careless gestures." His voice was the one that aimed to soothe the village from unnecessary alarm. Miss Marple inclined her head, appreciative of his steadiness, but she had the quiet confidence of someone who keeps a watching eye. She shared with him the smallest of her observations, the faint smell at the gate, the fact that Griselda had seen a figure the night before, and slackly nodded, half amused, at the accumulation of small facts in which he found no drama. As twilight drew its gauze over the vicarage lawn, the second envelope, folded and empty though it was, began to hum with a new implication. It was not merely a repetition of the first oddity. It carried the intention of continuing action. Someone had thought to deposit a further token. That very repetition suggested design. Miss Marple, who often gathered meaning from what people did again and again, felt the pattern begin to take a quiet shape. Griselda, unable quite to contain the small anxiety that had settled in her voice, asked, "Should we tell Dolly? Should we ask Mr. Rowland?" She broke off, as if the thought of addressing any stranger directly felt too intrusive for their kindly village. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea for Leonard, and, with the unobtrusive assurance of a gardener who tends what will grow, replied, "We shall do nothing rash. We shall observe and be kind. Sometimes, when people repeat a small thing, they reveal what they mean to do." That evening, as lamps were lit and the vicarage settled into the soft routine of hymn books and knitting, the sense of deliberate contact of a hand that would not be quieted by a single gesture lay upon them like the hush before a bell is tolled. It was a small unease, the sort that invited attention rather than alarm, and it would, in the morning, bring Dolly and Miss Marple together to consider how best to proceed. Chapter 6. Secrets at Gossington Hall. Gossington Hall was at its hospitable best that afternoon. Rugs warmed by the sun that slanted through tall windows, a sideboard trimmed with silver that caught the light, and a table laid with teacups so various they looked as if they told their own family stories. Dolly Bantry moved about with that energetic air which turned small gatherings into events. She piled slices of seed cake and lemon curd on a plate, with the brisk generosity of someone convinced that company and pastry were remedies for most uncertainties. Colonel Bantry, having settled into his favourite chair with his pipe poised between two fingers, surveyed the room with the easy air of a man who enjoyed the performance of village life as much as its substance. Miss Marple, arriving by no great hurry but by reliable appointment, took her seat where she could see most faces and yet remain unobtrusive. Around her were the people who fixed the parish's shape. Griselda Clement, with a discreet look as if the vicarage itself might be a fragile thing to protect. Mrs. Price Ridley, eager for the particulars of a curiosity. Miss Hartnell, whose hands had been busy that morning tying ribbons and now rested modestly in her lap. And, of course, Dolly's own bright manner, which softened opinions and widened conversation. Even Inspector Slack had been coaxed by Dolly's diplomacy into joining them for a short while, if only to put sense beneath their shared speculations. Dolly brought the subject forward with the light touch she reserved for matters that required both delicacy and communal attention. "We must talk about the vicarage letter," she said, arranging a tray of small sandwiches as if to conceal the gravity of the topic within a domestic ritual. "It is not a thing to frighten anyone, but it is curious. Miss Marple has seen it and said she believed small things often conceal larger matters. I thought we should hear what everyone might have observed." The conversation took that gentle, social shape which street Mary Mead favoured. Remarks and corrections laid down like napkins, recollections smoothed into patterns, and a good deal of humour to keep any edge from growing too sharp. Miss Hartnell, for instance, could not resist a small barb lubricated by shopkeepers' scents. "It's always the government men who bring the most mysterious business to our lanes," she observed, in a tone that suggested the phrase had currency as a gentle joke rather than a serious accusation. "They come and go with their neat coats and binders, and one never knows whether they have business or merely the manners of business." The remark raised a ripple of amusement and a faint, watchful silence. Mr. Rowland's name, which had been spoken of in the Blue Boar and in passing at Hartnell's, hung in the air. Dolly, with her customary hospitable courage, expanded the subject into an invitation. "Perhaps the newcomer might come to tea," she suggested, with the hope that kindness would always return useful answers. "If he is a retired civil servant, as people say, we shall be civil and see what we might learn. But if any of you have seen something of interest, speak freely." Colonel Bantry, whose conversational style was that of a man who preferred to pronounce upon matters when he had time to weigh them properly, cleared his throat and made his small complacent noise. "I happened to be passing near the lane last week," he began, pausing as if to ensure the right dramatic timing for a country anecdote, "and I saw the fellow. He was standing rather close to our old manor boundary, looking at the wall as if he had some thought about it. Curious, I thought. People do look at walls for many reasons, but the look was an intent one. The room's attention tightened at that. A boundary wall, a man studying it. These were the sorts of domestic observations that might, to someone less patient, remain mere trifles. Yet in Miss Marple's mind the detail fitted tidily with the other small facts she had gathered. The envelope at the vicarage gate, the newcomer at the Blue Boar, and the faint tobacco scent that had lingered like a whisper near the iron rails. She listened, not for drama, but for the pattern of daily things. Miss Hartnell, who kept her own ledger of comings and goings as neatly as she arranged her ribbons, let a sharper comment slip then. "Government men have a way of looking official about things that needn't be official," she said. They take notes in a small, precise way. One trusts they have their reasons, but one notices how they notice. Inspector Slack, who had been listening with a patient benevolence, gave his habitual shrug. One sees many types in a village, he said. A man looking at a wall could be looking at ivy or a sparrow's nest. We mustn't embroider the simplest sight into a conspiracy. Dolly, never content to let a remark lie idle, moved closer to the conversational centre. But if Mr. Rowland was indeed spending time about the wall, perhaps he saw something there. It need not be sinister, she added briskly, but in a small place such peculiar interests stand out. Miss Marple made a small sound of assent. She had frequently observed that people carry their private angles of attention like badges. Some notice gutters and how rain runs, others notice the way a door creaks. It was in these private templates of observation that human nature often revealed itself. The boundary wall, for example, could indicate an interest in property, in hedges, in historical lines of ownership, any of which could be perfectly innocent. Or, Miss Marple reflected, it might be connected to the simple fact of someone searching for a place to leave or retrieve something discreetly. She kept her thoughts private. She preferred to watch how people's faces shifted when certain words were spoken, and so Dolly, taking a practical step between comment and concession, began to speak of the letter in more direct terms. She read aloud, with a dramatist's relish softened by kindness, the bare facts that the vicar had found an envelope at his gate, and that a second envelope had later been slid beneath the door and proved empty. As she mentioned the initials upon the first HR, she watched the group. It was at this mention that Miss Marple did what she so often did, she noted, with the small, steady attention of a woman who has seen many small confidences, who shifted, who paled at the edge of their smile, who stirred their teacup as if to distract a hand. Miss Hartnell's fingers tightened on her napkin. Colonel Bantry pretended to take another pull at his pipe, though the ember had long gone, and, in the corner, Inspector Slack's eyes flicked with a practical focus that spoke of a man cataloguing facts. Everyone seems to have their suspicions. Who do you think really hid the letter at the garden gate? Dolly asked, suddenly, with that directness which was intended to produce plain answers, and which, in her house, usually did. The question was both an invitation and a little test of civility. Faces turned and various answers rose and settled like leaves. Mrs. Price Ridley guessed at romantic nonsense. Miss Hartnell suggested business or mistaken identity. Colonel Bantry grumbled about mischief that offended good order. Mr. Rowland, who was present by Dolly's invitation and had been gracious throughout, listened with polite interest and answered with the civil restraint of a man who does not invite speculation upon his private affairs. "I have no notion," he said, in that steady voice which suggested a preference for simple facts. "But if anything of consequence is amiss, it is right that it be known." It was then, as the talk returned to more domestic topics, the coming parish concert, Dolly's newly appointed flower arrangements for the altar, the vexed problem of Colonel Bantry's mowing of the wrong hedge, that Miss Marple noticed a small movement, not meant for the general air. Mr. Rowland's eyes had darkened, briefly, and his hand, the one that had displayed the modest signet ring, performed a slight, almost involuntary adjustment upon his little finger. The gesture was no more than the movement of a man who had touched a familiar thing for comfort, yet it held, for Miss Marple, the curious quality of comment. She allowed herself that small inward approval which comes when seemingly separate facts gather at last into a clearer outline. A man studying a wall, initials upon an envelope, a signet ring bearing matching letters. These were not accusations, but the beginning of a map. She would not speak the map aloud, for maps are useless until the owner knows how to read their landmarks. Instead, she put a cushion behind her back, took another sip of tea, and waited until someone else provided the next small fact that might turn the outline into a picture. The gathering at Gossington wound down in the practical fashion Dolly preferred. People rose with a mutual assurance of neighbourliness. Colonel Bantry found a topic to complain about that had nothing to do with secrets, and Miss Hartnell, who had the store to reopen, tucked her napkin beneath her arm and prepared to return to business. Yet as they took their leave, the little thread of attention which Dolly had drawn tighter that afternoon did not fall slack. It hummed, as such threads do, in the background of polite conversation. It altered the way hands were placed upon teacups, and the quiet of a look. Miss Marple watched them go with a small private contentment. The house had done what Dolly loved best, brought people together so that the village's trivialities might be turned into shared notice. As the last guest stepped into the sunlight and the door closed upon Dolly's energetic tidying, Miss Marple made a note of the small inward gesture Mr. Rowland had made, and of Colonel Bantry's comment about the wall. A dozen other small details, the way Miss Hartnell had spoken of government men, the mildness of Inspector Slack's dismissal. The polite affability of Rowland would, she knew, be of service later when patterns were to be read. That evening, as Gossington's lights dimmed and the ordinary sounds of the village resumed, Miss Marple gathered the small facts and set them like seeds upon the soil of her thoughts. She had the patience for such gardening. The small movement of a hand, she thought, is often more revealing than a loud declaration. The world's secrets prefer, in this village, to be coaxed into the open rather than torn there. Chapter 7. Inspector Slack intervenes. There are favours which village policemen perform without fuss, and there are those which require their patience. Inspector Slack, who had long since acquired the comfortable assurance that most of Street Mary Mead's peculiarities could be settled with a mild word and a brisk walk, favoured the first sort. On the morning he called, the lane smelled of wet earth and newspaper, and Miss Marple found him standing by her gate with his cap in hand, a look of practical benevolence upon his face. He had already, he said, visited the High Street and made polite inquiries. The postmaster had shrugged, the butcher had laughed, and the world seemed otherwise in order. Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea in the little parlour, while the village's quiet attentions arranged themselves in the safe geometry of cups and saucers. Dolly and Colonel Bantry had been persuasive in suggesting he should hear the facts, and Slack, to his credit, came with the intention of hearing what citizens thought to say. He listened as they rehearsed the particulars. The envelope at the vicarage gate, the second envelope slid beneath the door, the newcomer at the Blue Boar, and the little signet ring with its initials, and then he folded his hands in the way of a man who is not easily surprised. Empty envelopes, he said finally, with the mild, practical voice of one who prefers to economize alarm, are far less worrying than thefts and scrapes in the High Street. We've had a run of petty pilfering. A pack of cigarettes vanished from the grocer's back shelf, and a parcel meant for Hartnell went astray yesterday. He marked his words as if to weigh the proper allocation of attention. If I'm to be frank, this letter business reads to me like old hens gossiping. People like curious things, they talk about them. They put them back down again. There's no actionable harm. Slack's summation had the effect, as he intended, of settling several anxious brows. Dolly, however, whose energy could not always be diverted by the comforts of official dismissal, pressed forward with the ingrained good manners that made her persuasive. "Inspector, it is not that we expect you to rear your horse and gallop after every small oddity," she said briskly. "But when an action is repeated, a second envelope, women seeing figures at gates, one wonders whether there is a design more patient than mere accident. If you were to keep an eye—" Slack smiled the smile of one who delights in the social theatre of a village. "My dear Mrs. Bantry, if there is true cause for worry, I shall come running. But a policeman's job is to weigh time and resource. Petty theft strikes at livelihood. An anonymous envelope, unless it contains a threat, is not my highest priority." Miss Marple sipped her tea and watched his face with the friendly attention she habitually gave to those whose lives so depended upon orderly judgment. Inspector Slack had served the village well. He was steady and not easily excited. Yet Miss Marple knew also that steadiness sometimes permitted subtler, quieter patterns to pass under notice. A man who is used to seeing the world in bulk can miss the small, deliberate touches that indicate intention rather than chance. She remembered cases of her acquaintance where a trivial happening had been the thin end of an abiding matter. It was the sort of reflection she kept to herself, for it was not her way to call alarm where kindness sufficed. Griselda, who had been invited by Dolly in gentle conspiracy to the Bantrys' drawing-room, listened with the mild physiognomy of someone who is used to taking counsel. The vicar's unease, which had been at first a domestic perturbation, now acquired the weight of a parish concern. "We do not mean to make trouble for no one," she said, but Leonard found the empty envelope himself. "He feels—I do not know how to say it bothered. One is not used to feeling unsettled in one's own home. Dolly moved to comfort her with an arm which was businesslike in its affection. "We shall mind things," she said. "If Slack will attend to the high street, we shall attend to seeing if there is a pattern about these gates and hedges. Jane will help. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Slack inclined his head, half amused, half indulgent. "Watch by all means. Keep notes," he suggested with the officious geniality of a man who is content to outsource the village's finer curiosities to its keen citizens. "But don't catch yourselves into theory. If something of substance arises, you know where I am." There is a courtesy in his dismissal that is also a convenience. It allowed the village to continue its gentle life without harnessing official apparatus for every oddity. Yet it also left the space in which Miss Marple could exercise her patience. She treated Slack's words as one would treat a well-meant prescription, acceptable to follow, but not a barrier to one's own informed care. Miss Marple's memory is an economy of small facts. As Dolly insisted and Griselda fretted, she took out of the conversation the tiny pieces that had been left like seeds in the soil. The disguised handwriting on the first envelope, the initials that matched a polished ring, the faint trace of tobacco at the vicarage gate, the newcomer's studied interest in the boundary wall at Gossington. She thought, too, of Dr. Haydock's quiet comment about a distracted patient and of the postmaster's ledger entry about a man paying cash at the Blue Boar. Each item alone meant little. Together they suggested the soft architecture of intention I once noticed, Miss Marple said, in a voice so mild that it might have been a comment on the weather, how people will leave small things in the way of others to start the conversation they dare not begin face to face. It is a civilized method. In a way, it keeps matters private while inviting notice. There was no triumph in her tone, only the steady pleasure one takes in a carefully turned observation. Dolly, encouraged, suggested they take a practical measure. More watchfulness at the gates and lanes during the hours likely to see people coming and going. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "We will simply take strolls at times when the lanes are quiet, and if any of us notice someone lingering we shall be civil and find out what brings them." Griselda, who preferred the safety of parish routine to the uncertainties of observation, agreed reluctantly. "I will not go out alone at night," she admitted, "but I shall ask Leonard to lock the study door and to let me know if he finds anything more. I would not want to alarm people, but I should like to feel that we have done what is prudent." Colonel Bantry, who felt the pleasure of having a small matter to complain about, puffed his pipe and proffered a practical arrangement. "I shall be about the grounds at odd times," he said, "not because I am seeking drudgery, but because I enjoy my hedges. If anyone is prying about our walls, I shall happen upon them." Slack laughed and rose to take his leave, assuring them again that he would take any substantive complaint seriously. "You have my attention," he said, with the bland authority of a man who means it kindly. "But worry not, the world is seldom more dangerous than it is polite." When he had gone, Dolly and Miss Marple lingered to consider the quieter matters. Miss Marple remarked on the usefulness of patient watching and the charm of such communal attention. Dolly, always one to prefer action, began to make arrangements for a small rota of afternoon callers who might, under the guise of sociality, keep an eye on lanes and visitors. Griselda, who would not venture alone into the night, dutifully agreed to share in daytime observations and to keep the vicarage door more tightly closed after dusk. As they spoke, the talk lightened into domesticities, the mention of a new jam recipe, the problem of Colonel Bantry's lawn, the small embarrassment of an ill-fitted glove left upon a chair, and Miss Marple carried each domestic note gently in her memory. The matter rested for the moment, with the same patience with which one folds up a neat linen sheet. There was no urgency, but there was a gentle, watchful order. Before dinner that evening, however, Miss Marple found herself turning over in her mind a faint likeness she had not yet said aloud. She remembered, from some years past, a small scheme by which messages were made to be found in public places rather than entrusted to post. It had been done then, not to alarm, but to protect. The recollection was not yet an explanation, it was only a thread. She kept it, as she always did, like a stitch in a seam to be tested by the next small fact the village would supply. That night, while other folk slept and lamps gave their modest watch, Miss Marple sat by her window, listening to the soft creak of her gate and the distant, untroubled breathing of street Mary Mead. She would not, she knew, insist upon immediate drama. But she would keep watch in the patient way she favoured. The quietness of her vigilance was one of the village's small securities. Chapter 8. Night at the Vicarage gate. The night pressed in with a soft and secretive quality, the sort of hour when small villages tuck themselves under shawls of sound. Miss Marple had taken a modest cup of cocoa and settled herself by the parlour window with a knitted wrap about her knees. Content to let the village finish its day and to keep watch in her habitual unhurried fashion. The roses at the front of her cottage were gone to seed, but their stems made neat silhouettes against the dim lane. Far off, a church clock struck softly, and an owl called once from beyond the hedgerows. It was the sort of quiet which makes one's ears more open to the small noises that ordinarily slip unnoticed by. Dolly's plan for a gentle rota of watchers had been arranged with practicality and a warmth that disguised its purpose. Miss Marple's turn had fallen upon this evening, and she was pleased to oblige. There is, she had always believed, a virtue in paying attention. The Vicarage gate was only a short walk away, and the path between their houses wound under clipped yews and the occasional hawthorn, breathing the last of the day's scents. She wrapped a scarf about her throat and set out, moving as quietly as an old cat who knows the routes by heart. The lane at night was a study in softened shapes. The ironwork of the Vicarage gate showed as a darker knot against the pale of the sky, its bars catching the dim light of a neighbour's lamp. The hedges sighed faintly in a little breeze, and the gravel under Miss Marple's shoes made that comforting habitual sound of a village walkway. She paused a moment at the edge of the path, looking at the gate with the calm attention she gave to any small oddity, an old woman's ritual of review, and noted the crispness of the air, and the way the gate's hinge sometimes made a low, domestic creak when the wind pushed it. A figure appeared along the lane, exactly as if the evening had decided to produce one. He moved with the cautious economy of a man who kept himself composed in the light of day and in the stillness of night alike. Miss Marple knew him at once. Recently come to the Blue Boar, the retired civil servant who had been the subject of much polite curiosity. He paused as he came to the gate, his outline clear against the slightly paler wash of the vicarage's low garden wall. He wore a long coat and a hat that, when tipped, shaded his face. His hands were in his pockets, and his step had the slow deliberation of one who walks with thought upon his mind. He lingered a little. That was the first and most telling thing. He stopped within a yard of the ironwork and turned his head as if listening to the house, as if the quiet might sometimes answer a question aloud. He did not touch the gate. He did not slip anything through the bars. Instead, he drew his sleeve across his mouth in a slight, private habit. And then, after a pause, whose length is best measured by the small stirrings of the heart, he took 2 slow steps back and continued down the lane as if his pause had been nothing more than a moment of contemplation. There was no drama, no furtive whipping of a letter into the hedge. There was merely the polite, somewhat melancholy posture of a man who had come to a place where memory and inclination met. Miss Marple did not hurry after him. She stood a minute longer beneath the skein of night and the faint breath of the hedges, considering what his hesitation might mean. A man who comes, looks, and then goes without acting may be a man who was tempted by an action and restrained himself, or a man who wishes to be seen at a point between curiosity and fear. In a village, such small hesitations often carried the weight of meaning. She watched him go, the outline shrinking into the distance until the night took him as it would any form that chooses to be anonymous. When the sound of his steps had faded, Miss Marple crossed the path and moved closer to the gate. It was an action neither hurried nor fearful. She took it as one takes up the consideration of a plant that has suddenly shown an unfamiliar bloom. The ironwork was cold under her fingers. The ivy that clung to it trembled a little in that late breeze. She smelled, faintly, the echo of pipe tobacco in the air, a soft and domestic scent that carried the memory of pipes left to smoulder in armchairs, rather than of cigarettes flung carelessly upon the ground. It was a scent she knew well, the kind that sits in the woodwork of rooms where a man has been thinking for some time. Something else caught her eye. A small white tuck of paper half hidden by the hinge where the gate met its post. It lay like a fragment carelessly left by the hand that had no wish to be noticed. She bent and picked it up. Not a whole page, but a thin wedge, whose edges showed the raggedness of a hurried tear. The print was small. The paper of a broad grain one might expect of older colonial press rather than the local sheets, and in the fragment were letters that suggested names and places of distant parts. A fragment of Calcutta, and the half-word service, as if it had once been part of an announcement or a column concerning government postings abroad. Miss Marple turned the scrap between her fingers and noted the faint grit on the edge as though it had brushed the lane. The scrap's fibres were a little more brittle than the parish papers, and its ink had that faint sepia tone of long travel. She tucked it in the inside of her glove, so she might carry it safely, and leaning a moment against the post, allowed herself the pleasure of seeing how small facts begin to relate. A torn scrap naming a distant post, a man who had served in the colonial service and now wore a ring with those initials. These were in themselves only small hints. Together, however, they made a pattern more interesting than any single piece. She did not leap to conclusions. Roland might have carried that scrap in his pocket from some earlier time, or it might have caught in his coat as he walked along a high street where old papers blow about. But the fact that he had stopped by the gate and then left without acting suggested that his visit was personal. He had not come merely to pass, he had come to look. Miss Marple, who had often found the village to give up its secrets as much by repetition as by single acts, noted this as the most useful observation of the night. The night made small sounds around her. The rustle of ivy, the whisper of a fox at the hedgerow, the distant creak of a cart on the main road. She folded the scrap carefully into her pocket and took a quiet path back to her cottage. Pausing once to regard the vicarage where the windows were dark save for a thin amber in the study, as if the vicar were perhaps bent over late papers or the quiet religion of prayer. The gate stood, as it had stood for years, a domestic sentinel that had suddenly become the place of an odd private theatre. Miss Marple felt the small thrill of a puzzle's edge. To know that the newcomer had been at the gate by night was, in itself, only part of the tale. That knowledge became more telling when coupled with the scrap of a distant paper whose print spoke of places where Mr. Roland had served. These were the slender threads by which the fabric of an incident is later drawn taut. The initials upon a ring, the careful pause of a man at a gate, and a piece of foreign paper that had caught in the hinge. She walked home with a steady step and the scrap pressed to her palm beneath her glove. There are discoveries which need to be said aloud, and others which are best kept like seeds until one has the patience to see what they may grow into. Miss Marple, with the patient, intimate knowledge of a woman who is used to tending small things until they show their character, chose the latter. She did not rush to wake others. She did not call for Inspector Slack nor cause a stir. Instead, she made her way back under the owl's watch and the village's sleeping hush, feeling that the night had given her something more than a mere view. It had shown her that one of their quiet neighbours returned to the vicarage gate of his own accord. That small confirmation, a man one had observed, by day returning at night, and a scrap of paper that recalled his earlier life abroad was, she thought, a beginning rather than an answer. It was the kind of beginning she liked. Unobtrusive, domestic, and human. She folded the scrap into the pocketbook she kept for notes, and with the stillness of a woman who trusts the slow work of attention, went to bed. By morning, she knew, she would have more to consider. The scrap would be read and perhaps matched with other small facts. This evening's quiet watch had given her the particular pleasure of a mini-reveal. Roland had come to the gate of his own accord, and the night had left behind a trace that suggested his past. It was, in Miss Marple's mind, a line upon which further thought might be threaded, and for the patient gardener of human foibles, that was precisely where one begins. Chapter 9. Pieces together. The morning light slanted gently through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's parlour, turning the roses outside into soft silhouettes. A kettle sang quietly on the hob, and the faint scent of lavender polish lingered from the maid's early dusting. The village seemed subdued, as it often did after some days of quiet speculation. The church bells had rung, the high street had seen its early bustle, and now, street, Mary Mead sank into the rhythm of teacups, errands and neighbourly calls. It was in such domestic stillness that Miss Marple preferred to think. On the table before her lay a modest arrangement of objects. The folded envelope with its oddly disguised hand, the little scrap of colonial newspaper tucked safely between blotting paper, a glove that had carried the faintest whiff of tobacco, and her notebook filled with tidy penciled observations. She regarded them with the mild, almost distracted air of someone considering her knitting. Yet her blue eyes, clear despite the years, missed nothing. Dolly Bantry arrived first, bustling in with her usual mixture of enthusiasm and disarray. She carried a tin of biscuits that rattled cheerfully despite being rather battered. Colonel Bantry followed, pipe in hand, puffing abstractedly, as though he had been thinking of something entirely different: horses, perhaps, or the state of the garden wall at Gossington. Dolly dropped into a chair, her pearls slightly askew, and demanded at once whether there was progress, dear Jane. Miss Marple smiled, poured tea, and set aside her spectacles. "One might say," she observed, "that a pattern begins to emerge when small things are set together. Rather like patchwork." Colonel Bantry made a vague noise of approval, though his attention seemed fixed on refilling his pipe. Dolly leaned forward, positively gleaming with anticipation. Inspector Slack's arrival was far less gentle. He strode in with his habitual air of impatience, remarking at once that the village has quite worn itself out over nothing. He spoke of pilfered apples from the high street and a missing bolt of muslin from Mrs. Price Ridley's draper's counter. These, to his mind, were matters worth attending. The business of a stray letter at a gate was a mere trifle. A childish prank, if anything. Dolly bristled. "It's not a prank," she said stoutly. "People do not tuck strange notes in vicarage gates unless they mean something." Miss Marple, with her customary mildness, agreed only that children's games can sometimes hide very grown-up matters. Her calm tone had the curious effect of quieting the room, even Inspector Slack's protests. One by one, she reviewed the evidence with the patience of someone threading a needle. First, the disguised handwriting on the envelope, so strained in its effort to be different that it revealed a hand more than it concealed one. Such an attempt suggested anxiety rather than malice. Second, the curious initials, so neatly drawn they could as easily be a private sign as a person's monogram. Third, the scent of tobacco lingering near the gate on that first evening, the kind Colonel Bantry favoured, but also the sort Roland had been known to smoke, a pipe tobacco rather richer than the cigarettes the village boys occasionally filched. Fourth, the peculiar interest Roland had shown in the boundary wall at Gossington, pausing as if measuring it with his eyes. And finally, the scrap of colonial newspaper, unmistakably linked to Roland's earlier life in India, tucked by accident or design into the gate's hinge. As Miss Marple spoke, the little circle grew still. Dolly clutched her teacup, wide-eyed. Colonel Bantry tapped his pipe bowl gently against his shoe, his mind at last attending. Inspector Slack shifted in his chair, his expression sliding from impatience to reluctant interest. It was at this moment that Dr. Haydock arrived, summoned under pretext of Dolly's insistence that a medical man always knows what's ailing people. He had, in truth, been observing Roland with some concern. The doctor, genial and forthright as ever, confessed that the newcomer had shown signs of strain, nervous tension, poor sleep, a touch of melancholia. It was not physical so much as the wear of an old worry, pressed a little. Haydock admitted that he had once heard whispers scandal in the colonial service, some matter, not criminal, but socially wounding. A blotted page in an otherwise tidy record, he put it, and Roland, a man of reserve, seemed haunted by the shadow of it still. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly. "One does not always write a letter to demand money," she observed. "Sometimes, one writes to warn. A note left at a gate, not pushed under a door, might be meant for the eye of one man only meant to spare rather than expose." Dolly nearly clapped her hands. So it was a warning. Oh, Jane, how perfectly delicious. Not blackmail at all. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, still unconvinced but no longer dismissive. "A warning, you say? Well, perhaps. But why the secrecy, the handwriting, the whole performance? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Because, Inspector, in small places secrets must be handled with care. One does not cry a thing in the high street when it may be slipped gently under a gate. Those who know human frailty sometimes choose the quieter course. It was said with such simplicity that Slack found no ready answer. He muttered instead about verifying the newspaper scrap, though he pocketed his scepticism like a man reluctant to admit his pockets already contained too much. The conversation meandered to ordinary things: Colonel Bantry's roses, Dolly's tea service missing a saucer, the price of fish at the Blue Boar. Yet beneath these domestic notes ran the steady rhythm of revelation that the letter had not been a threat, but a quiet, desperate kindness. The odd handwriting, the initials, the scent, the newspaper, all had pointed to Roland, not as a culprit but as the one in need of protection. Miss Marple, tidying her papers, thought how often this was so, that in villages and in life, the simplest explanation was rarely the most obvious, but the most human. She did not speak all her conclusions aloud. Some matters, she knew, were best left to unfold. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Dolly sighed contentedly. "We are in the middle of something truly thrilling, Jane. Truly thrilling." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their gentle click. "My dear Dolly, the middle is often more comfortable than the end." But in her heart she felt the pieces settling together, like a quilt at last showing its pattern. The letter, the man, the secret, all threads of one fabric, woven not in malice but in warning. And yet, as with all patchwork, there remained spaces yet to be filled. That evening, as she put away the scrap of colonial paper and straightened her notebook, Miss Marple reflected that the picture was nearly whole. But not quite. The next discovery, she knew, would prompt the final stitches. Chapter 10. Truth at the Garden Gate. The morning sun filtered softly through lace curtains at the Vicarage drawing-room, illuminating the polished oak table that Mrs. Clement had decorated with a small vase of late roses from the garden. Their pale petals seemed almost too delicate for the season, but they lent the room a gentle fragrance, mingling with the faint scent of beeswax and old books. It was a scene entirely in keeping with village life, warm, faintly old-fashioned, and quite unsuspecting of the import of the gathering about to take place. Miss Marple, seated a little apart with her knitting bag beside her, had chosen a position from which she could observe all without appearing to do so. Dolly Bantry was effusive as ever, delighted to be at the centre of events, while Colonel Bantry tamped his pipe and looked rather as if he would prefer a good shoot to this parley. Inspector Slack loomed near the mantel, impatient but resigned, and the vicar and his young wife exchanged glances that were half anxious, half curious. Roland sat stiffly, his long fingers drumming against the arm of his chair, his complexion pale beneath the tan that still bore traces of foreign suns. It was in such domestic settings, Miss Marple knew, that truth most naturally emerged, never in grandiose confrontations, but in quiet words spoken over teacups and roses. She began gently, almost as though she were speaking to Dolly alone. "Sometimes," she remarked, "letters are not always what they appear to be. They can frighten, of course, but they can also protect." Dolly leaned forward eagerly. "Protect, Jane? But surely this one hidden in the gate, and with that strange handwriting, was meant to alarm." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was disguised, yes. But disguises often conceal not an enemy but the hand of one rather too anxious to shield himself." Inspector Slack shifted impatiently. "Come now, Miss Marple. You can't be telling us that the fellow who received the letter also put it there himself." Her needles clicked softly as she looked up. "That is precisely what I am saying, Inspector." A murmur went round the little group. Colonel Bantry let out a puff of smoke that wavered in the morning light. "Dash it all," he muttered. "Sounds a bit roundabout." "What?" Piece by piece, she laid out the threads of her reasoning, patient as a seamstress at her mending. The handwriting, she explained, had been deliberately disguised, but there were certain peculiarities of spacing and the form of the capital R that betrayed the writer. She had noticed them when comparing the note to a brief list Roland had jotted for Dolly at tea, quite absent-mindedly. Then there was the scent of the unusual tobacco, faint yet distinctive, which she had once noticed upon Roland's sleeve when he had brushed past her gate. It matched the faint aroma clinging to the paper. The initials, too cryptic, some thought, perhaps pointing to a blackmailer, but they were simply those of an acquaintance from Roland's colonial posting, whose name had surfaced briefly in village talk when the scrap of newspaper was discovered near the gate. A paper from overseas, torn and tucked almost as though to hint at something sinister. "Altogether," Miss Marple said softly, "it is not the pattern of blackmail, but of a man attempting clumsily, perhaps to divert attention. By creating mystery, he hoped to make any inquiry lose itself in shadows, rather than strike too directly at his past." Dr. Haydock, who had been silent until then, gave a grave nod. "There has been strain enough on him. Roland's years abroad were not without unpleasant incidents. A scandal, you might call it, but nothing beyond the weakness of youth and a certain indiscretion." His tone was kindly, if brisk. "He has been paying for it ever since with a troubled conscience." Roland lifted his head, the tension in his jaw betraying a long struggle. "Yes," he said at last, his voice low. "It is true. I thought, if it seemed some mysterious hand pursued me, people might look elsewhere, not too closely at me. I meant no harm, only to preserve a measure of respect in the eyes of the village." He looked round, almost pleadingly. "I was a fool." The room was very quiet. Dolly, moved despite herself, gave a little exclamation of sympathy. Colonel Bantry muttered something about young chaps always in a muddle. Even Slack, though pursing his lips, said nothing sharp. There was in the air a sense not of condemnation but of relief that the menace had been no menace at all, only the blunder of a man too fearful of gossip. Miss Marple allowed the silence to rest, her hands folded now upon her lap. "We are none of us free from folly," she said gently, "but sometimes kindness can mend what fear has tangled. The letter was never a threat. It was, in its way, a warning, perhaps even a protection from an old acquaintance who wished you to tread carefully. And you, Roland, sought to mask it with mystery. The truth is simple enough, once seen in the proper light." Roland bowed his head. "You are more merciful than I deserve, Miss Marple." "Not mercy, merely observation," she replied, with her faint smile. By the time the gathering dispersed, the mood had softened. Dolly, already planning her next tea, chattered of how village tongues would wag less harshly now that matters were explained. Colonel Bantry, still puffing, declared that what a man did abroad was nobody's concern if he behaved properly at home. Griselda Clement gave Roland a kindly squeeze of the hand, while her husband murmured a prayerful word of encouragement. Even Inspector Slack, though gruff, conceded, "Well, Miss Marple, you've a way of tying threads, I'll grant you that." Later, at her own cottage, Miss Marple stood by the window looking out over her garden, where the last roses drooped upon their stems. The air carried the faint creak of the vicarage gate as someone passed, and the evening light touched the thatched roofs of Street Mary Mead with a quiet glow. Human weakness, she reflected, was a constant, like the seasons, like the rustle of leaves at dusk. But so too was human kindness, the willingness to forgive and to understand. She bent to gather a rose for her table, its petals bruised yet still sweet, and thought that perhaps the garden gate had done its duty after all, holding a secret just long enough for truth and charity to bloom. In the days that followed, Street Mary Mead slipped back into its quiet rhythm, as though the curious affair at the garden gate had been no more than a passing breeze. The lace curtains at cottage windows fluttered once more in the autumn air. Roses, a little tired yet still fragrant, nodded along Miss Marple's fence. At the Blue Boar, talk turned from whispers of scandal to the proper measure of currants in a plum cake, while church bells on Sunday gathered the villagers in their familiar pews. Yet, beneath the calm, one sensed that human nature, with all its little weaknesses and vanities, remained unchanged. And so, perhaps, new mysteries might one day arise. Still, for the present, the vicarage gate creaked only with the gentle passing of neighbours, and Miss Marple's hearth glowed steadily, offering the comfort of warmth, tea, and quiet understanding. Thank you for joining us in the quiet lanes and gardens of Street Mary Mead. In such places, it is often the smallest details, a half-heard remark, a folded scrap of paper that reveal the greatest truths about the human heart. For mysteries, after all, are never so far away as we think. They are woven into the fabric of everyday life, waiting only for a careful eye to untangle them. We hope you will return again, to sit a while with us for the next tale. Until then, may your evenings be peaceful, your firesides warm, and your gardens ever in bloom.